Well, now we have reached the final module in our course, Module 8, and we're continuing our discussion of the rise and fall of freedom, and especially the transformation of American society. And the final chapter that we'll be reading in this module is called Jurisprudence and Constitutional Reconstruction. What we've been talking about is the consequences of the pivotal event of the modern and postmodern world, which Nietzsche summed up at the end of the 19th century as the death of God. I think we have seen in previous sessions that Western civilization was definitively shaped by biblical religion, and particularly Christianity. Western civilization is historically known as Christendom. And this is emphatically true of American society and American political order, which was profoundly shaped by biblical and Christian presuppositions. John Adams once said, "Our Constitution is made for a religious and moral people and none other, indeed for a Christian people." It's because Christian presuppositions undergird all of our institutions, our traditional institutions. Again, just think of the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights. Well, none of that makes any sense in the absence of the biblical worldview, which it presupposes. And what has been happening, certainly since the French Revolution, picking up steam in the 19th century and moving through the 20th century and into our own time, is the progressive evisceration of Christianity as the publicly shared foundation of our society, the spiritual foundation. Well, because as we stated at the outset of this course, there is an inseparable relationship between culture and the cult, the religious association, the religious worldview of the people. The transformation in our religious worldview is leading to a transformation in our political and social order, and not in a good direction. As Christian presuppositions become less widely shared, the constitutional structure of American society has been crumbling. There is no question about that. The political order that we have today, if the framers were to reappear in time, they would scarcely recognize us. Many, in fact, most of the powers that they attempted to deny to government are routinely exercised by government at all levels, but particularly by the federal government, which has moved into a position, as I said, unrecognizable by historical standards. Many movements have contributed to this. There is no one cause, but we can certainly look back over the course of modern and postmodern history to see certain significant developments, the death of God movement being fundamental and pivotal. But that had many consequences in its wake. In the American context, it led to the rise of a certain kind of constitutional interpretation and embedded in the larger movement of American progressivism. Progressivism actually emerges in the postmodern world in the wake of the death of God, because what else dies if God is dead? Think through the significance of what that means. What else dies along with the God of the Bible? The omniscient, omnipotent, all-knowing, all good, all just, creator of heaven and earth, and of each individual made in his image, endowed with reason and free will, put on earth to achieve the most profound of all spiritual purposes. Well, all that is gone. What dies along with the death of God, in particular, that is of particular concern to us and widely apparent in our society, is the decline of the belief in a big T truth, that is an absolute truth that human beings don't create, that we can't change, that is given to us by God, the author of our being and of our world, a truth that transcends time, that is eternal, everlasting, in existence from the beginning of creation until the end of time, We've talked about that in certain respects in its moral form as the law of nature or natural law, but it also applies more widely to the very concept of truth itself, that there is an objective reality that while we are always limited, we see through a glass darkly. Man has been given reason to try to apprehend the truth of things. Well, most of you have grown up in a society that rejects this very concept of an absolute truth. Instead, you've grown up in a postmodern world that says there is no big T truth. There's only your truth and my truth and his truth and her truth and that group's truth and that culture's truth. Cultural and moral relativism in an extreme form are one of the consequences of the death of God. There is no absolute truth of any kind that transcends particular perspectives and opinions and the transitory circumstances of time. So one of the consequences of the death of God is the death of the belief in absolute truth that transcends human history. So what's left? Nothing but history. And what is history? Human experience in time. So all we're left with, if God is dead, is human history. And so history becomes sort of divinized. Don't be on the wrong side of history, as if history is some divine entity that you don't want to be on the wrong side of. Progress is said to involve just mere passage of time. As history moves forward, things progress. Progress is defined almost strictly by movement in time. Tomorrow is more progressive than today, and the day after that is more progressive than yesterday, and so forth. As a consequence, the past has become relativized and relatively meaningless and less binding on our conscience and our actions. Why should we be bound by the ideas of the past, which we have progressed beyond, right? Movement through time. And one of the ways this progressive view of the priority of history over nature or God or anything else has been manifested in what we call constitutional jurisprudence. And I know this might seem a fancy concept, but let me explain to you how important this is. The old Constitution of the framers, the original intent of the framers, is hanging on by a thread. I heard someone yesterday say our Constitution is at the moment paper thin. Yes, we still have it to a certain extent, but as I said, the vast majority of the powers that the framers intended to prohibit government from exercising are routinely exercised. Now, how did that happen? How did we lose the old Constitution? Even though we still have it in name, we can go look at it. And we have, again, the framers, as we've seen, have left a provision for how we could amend the Constitution if that should prove wise or desirable, to go through a very difficult and complex amendment process that ensured that the overwhelming majority of the people actually did want to change the Constitution. Well, we have not really amended the Constitution very much over the course of the past several hundred years. We only have 27 amendments, and the first 10 were the initial Bill of Rights. But yet the Constitution has dramatically changed. Now, how did that happen? It didn't happen by amendment. It happened rather by changing interpretation of the existing language of the Constitution. Now think about it. Remember, the role of the judicial system, especially the federal judicial system, and at the ultimate apex, the U.S. Supreme Court, is to decide whether any acts of the legislature or the executive are constitutional or not. That is, whether they are in accord with the written Constitution. Now, how do you do that? If you imagine you're a justice on the Supreme Court and you are asked to rule on whether or not a given piece of legislation is constitutional or not. Well, obviously, first thing you have to do, you have to know what the Constitution says. That's obvious. But it's not enough just to read the Constitution, because you also must interpret the meaning of that Constitution. And today in contemporary American society, there are two competing schools of so-called constitutional interpretation or constitutional jurisprudence. We call them originalism and the living Constitution. And they have really almost opposing understandings of what the Constitution means. Originalists there are two schools of thought. There's original intent and original meaning. Original intent, the person who adheres to the originalist interpretation of the Constitution says, well, what does the Constitution mean? Well, they say it means what the people who wrote it intended it to mean. Now, we have a wealth of historical information over what the framers intended in writing the Constitution. Volumes and volumes and volumes and volumes of written documents. So we have a pretty clear idea of what they intended the constitutional provisions to mean and to accomplish. An originalist says we should be bound by the original intention of those people who wrote the Constitution, or else the original meaning that was accepted by most people at the time. It's one of those two things, slightly different, but nevertheless still holding on to an unchanging intent or meaning. And if you interpret the Constitution that way, well, what happens? The Constitution doesn't change because the original intent of its authors can't change over time. It is what it is. Or the original meaning held by the people of the era can't change over time. It is what it was. So that if you interpret the Constitution through an originalist lens, the Constitution doesn't change. It means what it says, and it means what its authors intended. Now, that's one way of looking at the Constitution, and we have justices on the court today who hold on to that perspective. But there is another very influential way of interpreting the Constitution that is called the philosophy of, quote, the living Constitution. The term arises during the Progressive Era by an author who wrote a book called The Living Constitution. And the basic idea there is that when a judge is asked to decide whether something is constitutional or not, they have to imbue it with a living meaning they have to bring it up to date to take into account the contemporary society, the contemporary values of the American people, the changing historical circumstances. America is not the same today as it was in the 18th century. And they have to bring to bear their knowledge of contemporary circumstances and values and use those to interpret the existing language of the Constitution in such a way that it brings it up to date with the modern or contemporary world. The argument is, if you don't do that, you have a kind of dead Constitution. You're bound and stuck by the static, antiquated ideas of people who lived in another century, who had a different worldview, with different demographics, different religious beliefs, different circumstances, and you're stagnant. You're not living. You're not progressing. So, do you want to have a dead Constitution? Well, nobody wants that, right? You want to have a living Constitution, and that it means transforming it, not by amending it, but by reinterpreting the language in line with contemporary ideas. And this, for the past 100+ years, and continues as we speak today, has been the way in which our constitutional order has been transformed by judges, progressive judges, who adhere to the philosophy of the living Constitution, taking the explicit language of the Constitution, but imbuing it with a meaning very often completely at odds with the original intent or original meaning.